Hello, hi. Welcome to my possibly slightly deranged attempt to wrap up the 30 books that I read in March and April, some of which I really don't remember very well. Now, normally I would begin like a monthly wrap up with some stats about what I've been reading, what formats I've been reading, where I've been getting my books from, what decades the books were written and published in, all of that sort of stuff. But honestly, today, my darlings, I don't think we have time. So I will probably leave that chat for, I might do it in my May wrap up, like give you a little bit of a headlines, or I might just like save it for a half-year check-in, because we got a lot of books to talk about. I've kind of roughly chunked them, not into how I feel about them, but like kind of into like rough themes. So the first section of books are all books that I have spoken about at greater length in another video. So in theory, we can get through them a little faster. First up, we have All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. If you've seen the book-to-screen adaptation video that me and my best friend Farmer did, you will have seen me talk about this book there. This is a historical fiction novel set in France and Germany, following a young French girl who is blind and her father, who works in a museum, who accidentally on purpose maybe ends up in sort of caretaking this very expensive diamond because the Nazis are coming and they want to get out of the city. They don't want the Nazis to kind of get all of their really valuable artifacts from the French museums. So it follows her and how her life intersects, moves alongside, involves a young German boy who is an orphan and is fascinated by radios, becomes a radio engineer and a reluctant Nazi, and their stories and how they come together. It's a very split timeline. We move back and forth through time, we move back and forth through perspectives. I really enjoyed this book. I think it's a page turner. I found it really readable. It was well written. I had a couple of question marks about the use of disability, but I think overall it was like an enjoyable book, although on reflection I don't think I enjoyed it as much as I did at the time. I don't think it's one that stayed with me as much, but it is infinitely better than the Netflix adaptation. So yeah, there's that. All the Light We Cannot See. Wow, only 3 minutes in. This is boding well. This is boding really well. Next, I'm going to talk about 4 books that I read in my last Impatient vlog that I uploaded, so my March Impatient vlog. If you're new to my channel and haven't seen those before, this is part of my like reading intentions for the year. I wanted to be more impatient with my reading, so get to novels quicker that I was really excited about, rather than feeling like I needed to save them for a rainy day. So I pick up 4 books on the 1st of every month and I read them over the course of the month, and I call them my like impatient books. So the first one that I read for this video was The Employees, workplace novel of the 22nd century by Olga Ravn, which was translated from the Danish by Martin Aitken. This is such a weird little book. It's told as a series of witness testimonies. There's some kind of internal investigation happening on board a spacecraft after allegedly something has happened. We don't know what at the start of the book. And some of these witness testimonies are from humans, and some of them are from humanoids who work alongside the humans, who have, you know, a very high level of artificial intelligence but are not human. And you don't know necessarily who is who when they're reading, so there's no names attached to anything. It's all like testimony 43, testimony 77, and we don't even know if some of them are repeated voices coming back. And then it builds towards this sort of crescendo, and I thought it was really masterfully done. It was really clever, kind of cerebral little book. But yeah, really kind of got to the core of a lot of issues and questions around work and how that fits with our identity, how our humanity can be chipped away by capitalism. That might be my read on the book rather than the book itself. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. It was a fast read. It was very, very weird. And she had another book that I thought for sure was going to be on the International Book Along list this year, but wasn't. But I definitely want to get to that soon. So that was a high point. We will come later to some Euros reading that has not been a high point, but that was good. I really liked that one. The next one I read in physical copy. This is Pity by Andrew McMillan, and this is my most impatient read to date because I went to a book talk of this book, and so it had only just come out, and then I think I read it about a week after it came out, which for me, that's about as impatient as I have ever been. And in many ways, this Andrew McMillan is a poet. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with his poetry, and this is his first novel. And as you would expect for a poet, the language in this book is absolutely beautiful. And it follows, if you're familiar with his poetry, it explores similar themes of identity and class and queerness. But we're basically following 3 generations of a family in Barnsley, which is where Andrew McMillan is from, and kind of following them. And the book is looking at identity, it's looking at intimacy, it's looking at the relationship that we have with our hometowns or home villages or home wherevers, wherever they may be, and the different narratives that there are from the inside of those communities and the narratives that there are outside of those communities. It also has a scene in which one of the characters does a drag performance as Margaret Thatcher. So it's very much a book that's about location. It's very specifically about Barnsley, but it also reminded me a lot of like where I live up in the northeast of England. There are certain like cultural commonalities and sort of narratives that go on, and I really enjoyed it, although I thought it would stay with me a little bit more than it has. But I think that is also just because I have read a lot of books in the interleaving time, like more than I probably should have. Do you know what I mean? But I really, really recommend it. It was great. The third book that I read in that vlog was This Is How You Lose the Time War by Max Gladstone and Amal El-Mohtar. This is a sort of queer speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy book. And it is told from 2 alternating perspectives of 2 people, red and blue, who are on opposite sides of a time war. And so their stories are sort of intersecting and moving around each other, and they start leaving letters to each other, scattered all throughout time, and those letters end up being stored in like really weird sort of different ways, like inside a seed which grows into something, and it's got really beautiful, lovely poetic imagery throughout it. And it is a love story of sorts, which I really I think for me it was a very different sort of queer story in terms of like I haven't read a lot of like genre fiction that has queer reps, so this was really nice to me. I mean, I know there is loads of it. I'm just saying I haven't read it. So yeah, I enjoyed this, but I did think a little bit that the world of it felt a little bit nebulous. Like the world building was very delicate and lyrical, and I actually would have liked something a little bit more grounded and substantial, because I couldn't quite grasp the stakes of what was talking about, because I think the stakes were very high, it's just they didn't feel very high to me. And I will also say that there is a twist that I saw coming from really early on, but I can't work out if that's a intentional, like we're supposed to see it as like an inevitable thing because time is circular, or if it just wasn't a very well sort of buried lead. I will say though, I do think I'm an outlier on this. Most of my friends who have read this book absolutely love it. So if you like queer stories and want to branch into a bit more like genre fiction for queer stuff, then I recommend it. If vice versa, you read a lot of like fantasy, sci-fi, and you're wanting to diversify and read a little bit more queer stuff, I think it's a good one for that. It's a really quick read. Some of the writing is really, really lovely. It just overall didn't quite have the emotional impact that I wanted. And speaking of emotional impact, the last book that I'm going to talk about is one that has really, really grown on me since I recorded that vlog. This is A Single Man by Christopher Isherwood. So this is a classic book. I read Goodbye to Berlin last year by Christopher Isherwood and absolutely loved his writing style. I loved his writing even more in this. This is the first book of quite a few that I'm going to be talking about that do interesting things with time and how time spans in the novel. So this is 24 hours of one man's life pretty much, and he is a British man living in California whose long-term live-in partner has recently died. He's a gay man, his partner was a man, but they weren't sort of out, and so his grief that he's feeling is very, very internalized, and he hasn't even told his neighbors that his partner has died. And we're just following him and sitting in the grief with him. And there were parts of this book that like properly choked me up. And I think it is one of my favorite books on reflection that I have read this year. It's really, really stuck with me. More than I think at the time, and it's really made me want to rewatch the Tom Ford film adaptation of it, because I remember seeing that in the cinema when it came out and loving it. And I feel like Tom Ford has never quite hit the heights that he hit with A Single Man with any of his other feature films, but that's by the by. Loved this. So that's most of the books that I've talked about in videos. I'm going to move into a section now that is all of the books that I have read in the last 2 months for this Euros challenge, which has a little bit become the bane of my life. So if you don't know, I decided this year it would be fun to read a book for every country that is competing in the Euros 2024 football, brackets, soccer, if you're from that part of the world, competition before the competition kicks off, and do a fun little silly thing where, based on how much I enjoyed those books, I try and predict the winner of the Euros. I have had a very, very mixed bag with how much I have enjoyed my reading for this challenge. In hindsight, if I do something like this again, firstly, tell me that maybe not, maybe I don't have the personality for this, but also tell me to give myself a much bigger lead in and much more time to research the books that I wanted to read, because on reflection, I was scrambling for some of these to just find a book that I had access to through the library or through my Everand subscription, because I was trying not to buy extra books just for the sake of this reading challenge, because that felt like a silly thing to do. So I've ended up reading a lot of books that if I had read the premise any other time, I probably wouldn't have picked up. So my lack of enjoyment for some of the titles that I am going to be talking about is probably more to do with that. Like, they just probably are not books for me, rather than books that I was specifically wanting to read outside of the challenge. Does that make sense? That's not always the case, though, I will say. Anyway, that's enough of an intro. The first book I'm going to talk about, so the first two, actually, I did chat about a bit in the vlog I filmed when I went to Paris. Any of the videos I've mentioned, by the way, I will link in the description box down below, as well as all of these book titles, because I know I'm kind of like rattling through them here because I don't want to keep you here for hours and hours. And it's a really nice day outside, so I would rather not spend 6 hours here talking to you about books. That's a lie. I would love to spend 6 hours here talking to you about books. I just don't think you'd watch it. Okay, so the first one is The Attic by Danilo Kiš, which is translated from the Serbian by John K Cox. Yeah, we're really kicking off with one that I have almost no memory of. This is a book about a man. It's fun because not very much happens in this book, so it's really hard to describe it. It's a short novella. It's a kind of coming of age. young man testing his sort of intellectual and philosophical muscles a little bit. He's wanting to be a writer, and he's got all of those like very pretentious ideals that many of us have in our early 20s, where we think we're going to completely revolutionize whatever area of, you know, work it is that we go into. I was slightly disappointed in this because I did know that the main character refers to himself as Orpheus, and that he refers to a woman that he's in a relationship with as Eurydice, and I was really hoping that there might be more of a riff on that Greek myth, but as far as I could tell, there wasn't really. This was fun. Some of the writing was quite funny. I think he was poking fun at himself a little bit, but also it was just a little bit like navel-gazy for me, and unfortunately I don't really remember very much about it. However, the next book has really stuck with me, which is The Birthday Party by Laurent Mauvignier, which is translated from the French by Daniel Levin Becker. This book, like the Christopher Isherwood, is also a book that takes place over a very condensed time period. This is roughly 36 hours, and it is a 500-page book. I really loved this book in the end, but I can completely see why it has been so divisive, and why some people have picked it up, read the first few pages and gone, absolutely not. Because it takes place over 24 hours, it's just over 24 hours. I think it goes from like afternoon through to the evening of the following day, I think. But this is set in a little hamlet in the French countryside. We have 4 principal characters. We have a man, his wife, their daughter, and their elderly female neighbour and her dog, 5 principal characters, and she's an artist. And we move between each of their perspectives, and the writing style of this I found really effective, but very stressful. So what Laurent Mauvignier manages to do is really replicate brilliantly the way that when we are in the present moment, we are never, or very rarely, unless you're really good at mindfulness, very rarely completely present. We're always constantly getting reminded of things in the past, or we're worrying about something in the future. And so it's got some of the sentences in this book are really long, not as long as some of the sentences that we're going to come to read, but real long. It was quite stressful. Because what's happening is they're preparing for this birthday party. It is the wife's birthday, and the husband and wife have a bit of a tricky relationship. He low-key thinks she hates him a bit, but it's her birthday and he really wants it to be perfect, and he's like stressing himself out, like trying to make all the plans. And then we realise that something is going on, and the tension in this book just ramps up and up and up, and you think he can't do it any tighter, and then he just keeps going. And it is like, it goes from being a book that feels like, I will admit, a bit of a slog at first, to like such a fucking page turner at the end. Like, I really, really liked this book. Thank God for France. I really enjoyed this. And then yet another book that does weird things with condensing time. This is my Ukraine pick. This is Nadezhda in the Dark by Yelena Moskovich. There's no translator on this one because it was written in English. Yelena Moskovich was born in Ukraine, but her family fled when she was quite young to the US. This was written in English. And this book actually takes place in a few quiet moments. So there is a couple, the speaker, who I don't think we know the name of, and her girlfriend, Nadezhda, or Nadia. And the entire book takes place in these quiet moments in a flat in Berlin. They've just sat down on the bed and they're looking out the window at this kind of growing darkness in Berlin. Nadia has just come home from work and they're just sitting next to each other in this sort of quiet, intimate silence. And what the book is the internal monologue of the main character. And it is a book that is written in verse, and that lends itself really well because this book does more regularly and in greater chunks than The Birthday Party. This book is about that present moment, but it's also the speaker is reflecting on her early life. She's reflecting on earlier parts in their relationship. She's thinking about their future, and all of it's taking place in this condensed sort of short amount of time. And it was really interesting because it goes from sort of really happy, small, intimate memories that she has of the two of them, right the way through to really traumatic memories that she has of fleeing Ukraine when she was younger, of instances of hate crimes that she's been involved in, that she's witnessed. She's tackling her own mental health. She has a sort of unnamed mental health condition, but we do know that she has experienced suicidal thoughts in the past, and that she has lost a friend, a fellow queer friend, to suicide. So there's some really heavy topics in this book, and I think it was a really brilliant way of exploring, even for people that are very intimate with each other, all of the things that exist around us that don't often go spoken, and all of the things that we bring with us into a relationship or into our present, all these kind of like things from the past. So I really liked this. I didn't love it, but I think it was really interesting, and I was surprised that it didn't, for a book that's quite short and that's written in verse, it actually wasn't a very quick read. And I think that's because some of the subject matter was really difficult. I had to take quite a few breaks from reading this book, but I think it was interesting, and I think there was quite a lot of sort of semi-autobiographical stuff going on in here, and that lends it a sort of extra sort of potency sometimes, I think. And I definitely will look for other things written by this author, because I enjoyed it. Right. So we're going to hop over the border now from Ukraine into Poland and swap Women Loving Women for Men Loving Men. This is Swimming in the Dark by Tomasz Jedrowski. Again, no translator for this one, as the book was written in English. The book opens with the main character. I can't remember either of the characters' names in this book, so apologies. But the main character is living in New York, and he hears on the radio that martial law has just been declared in the Soviet Republic of Poland. And this prompts him to reflect on his time growing up in Poland and a relationship that he had there. So, and then the remainder of the book from that point on is the story of his life and this relationship that he had in Poland. So we know going into it that whatever romance happens here is probably not going to last. So the majority of the book follows two boys who meet when they're in their late teens. They meet when it's like it's like military service, but agricultural. So like, I guess all of the like teenagers have to go and like work on these farms over the summer. It's like a compulsory thing. So our boy goes and meets this other boy there, and they fall in love with each other, and it's very lovely and very tender and intimate. And there's this lovely sort of like blissed out chapters where they're camping by this lake, and it's all very wonderful, but it's a quarter of the way through the book, and we know this is not going to end well. So there's this real sort of like sad yearning that kind of permeates the whole thing. And after they finish their agricultural service, they go back to the city that they're both from, and they continue their relationship, but it becomes increasingly clear that they have very different expectations for what their lives will be. So our main character wants to leave Poland. Poland is still under the under USSR control. It's communist, and it is not a fun time for queer people. And our main character wants to move to America, and obviously we know because of that opening chapter that he has moved to America, but his partner really doesn't. He actually is very patriotic, actually believes in what the state is trying to do and wants to be part of it. And crucially, despite he's not a character that feels like he's got like internal homophobia necessarily, but he does want to marry a woman and have children, and he sort of thinks he can do that and still keep this other relationship and kind of just split himself in half like that. And the story kind of goes on from there. So I actually picked this book up hoping that it would be like a Men-Loving Men Polish version of Chloe Michelle Howard's Sunburn, which is a book that it keeps going up in my estimations the more I read it. I read it last year and I absolutely loved it. That's a sapphic Irish coming of age story that does share a lot of similar components to this book. It's queer, it's coming of age. There's, you know, one character that wants to come out, one character that for whatever reason it doesn't. It's exploring all the reasons why how society is set up makes it difficult for queer people to feel like they can authentically be themselves and be accepted, and lots of just like achy yearning. But on the whole, I did feel like some of those feelings were the way in Sunburn where we really sit in those feelings. Yeah, I felt a little like this was just rushed along a little bit too much, sadly. But I do recommend it, particularly if you are looking for queer stories from different time periods and different parts of the world. I overall thought it was like, I thought it was well written. There was some really beautiful imagery, particularly around water and darkness, as you'd expect from the title, that I enjoyed. So yeah, I liked this one overall. Okay, next up was my pick for Italy. This was The Girl at the Door by Veronica Raimo, which was translated from the Italian by Stach Lukchev. This is a difficult book, man. Not in terms of how it's written, but in terms of its subject matter. And I think there will be a lot of people that just straight up won't want to read it. And I would understand why. I was intrigued. So it's called The Girl at the Door, and it begins with a girl at a door. And she is knocking on the door of a professor's house to speak to his live-in partner who's pregnant, and to tell her that she is that she was sexually assaulted by her partner, and as in by the professor, and that she's going to be pressing charges. But the book is not about that girl. It's not about the survivor of the sexual assault. It's about the two people that live in that house. It's about the man and the woman. So the professor and his partner. And we alternate between their perspectives. And it is about the aftermath of those allegations having been made. Now, the man doesn't deny that he slept with the student. This was prior to him being in a relationship with his current partner. He doesn't deny that they had a relationship, but he says it was consensual, and the girl says that it wasn't. And it really gets into the nuances of that, and that is not comfortable or pleasant to read, because he is deliberately portrayed as being quite misogynistic and doesn't really think he's done anything wrong. I will read you a quote a little bit later that I think captures why this book was so hard to read. But they also, on top of that, they live in this weird utopian sort of commune place. So the stakes are quite high for this couple because they are outsiders who have moved to this community and are sort of made to feel like foreigners anyway. So even outside of the central narrative, they feel that they are being judged all of the time, and that their position in the society there is very precarious. And so, you know, if he will not only lose his job, they will lose their home, they will lose their community and where they've built a life together. So he's railing against that a lot of the time in his sections. Meanwhile, she, the partner who's pregnant, is then reflecting on her relationship with this man and drawing parallels and asking herself questions about whether or not she feels like the power dynamics in their relationship are actually 100% right. And she's fascinated by this girl because the man admits to himself, though not to his partner, that he was desperately in love with this student of his, and sort of compares his partner negatively to this girl quite regularly. And he also spends a lot of the time in his narrative, he's sort of reliving and fantasizing about former interactions, like sexual interactions that he had with this student, and sort of proving to himself that he doesn't believe that he assaulted her or raped her. And it's really difficult. This is one line from the book that I think captures why it was so difficult. This is him. He says, "This is about a girl who felt she was raped. The point is that 2 years ago, she didn't feel raped." And so it's just, I did not enjoy reading it. I think it was exploring interesting things. It's an incredibly sinister, very confrontational book. And I think if you are interested in picking it up, just take care of yourself with the reading experience, because it was a lot. It's quite short. It's very short, actually. I think it's under 200 pages. But yeah, it was a lot. Okay, the next book is from Spain. This is the Book of All Loves by Agustín Fernández Mallo, and this was translated from the Spanish by Tomasz Bunstead. This, like The Birthday Party, is another Fitzcarraldo publication, and if you are familiar with Fitzcarraldo, you know that they tend to gravitate towards translated fiction that is very experimental and a little bit left field. And this was definitely one of those books. This is another odd little book. It is one that I think in the end I appreciated more than I liked it. So it's about a couple. Well, there's kind of two, it's hard to describe, bear with. There is a central narrative, but the central narrative doesn't constitute a very big part of the book. Let me talk about the narrative first, and then I'll talk about the rest of the book. So this is about a couple who are from Colombia, and they go on holiday to Venice. And while they are there, weird things start happening. Like, I can't remember what sense it was, but like St. Mark's Square in Venice, the really famous, is it St. Mark's? Like something happens there where either there stops being any sound or there stops being any smell. It's like a weird sort of, when I say weird stuff happens, I mean weird stuff happens. And it's very, very surreal and odd. And the woman goes back home for a bit, and then her partner stays. And then she comes back to join him, and then stuff's got even weirder since she was last there. So there's that narrative. But I would say about 60% of the prose is made up by these definitions of love. It is the Book of All Loves that makes up the rest of the story. And these follow the same format. And there's dozens and dozens and dozens of them in the book. And they go one after the other for a big chunk, and then you get a bit of narrative, and then you get another big chunk of definitions. So here's an example. Let me read you an example. And they all follow this format. It goes definition, brackets, and then like a type of love, like the type of love that's a definition for. And then the man and the woman respond to that, and they switch up the order that they respond in. Sometimes he speaks first, sometimes she speaks first. And that's it. And sometimes the definitions are 1 sentence long, sometimes they're 2 pages. I don't know if, well, I mean, that's hard. I read it on an e-reader with a real big font, so I don't actually know how many pages they were. But sometimes they were really long and sometimes they were really short. Here's an example. It says, looking at the world in silence, and in silence writing what is seen, writing the silence itself, this is what it is to love the world. Brackets, silent love. Where has it come from, this whole landscape of wounds, he says. From bodies without passion, which are also landscapes, she says. So it is highly poetic and lyrical, very abstract. And some of those definitions I absolutely loved. I think if you're looking for a book that you just kind of want to allow to wash over you, and that's got really beautiful imagery and ideas in it, or even, I actually think this would be a great like reference book for like, if you just wanted some good like writing stimulus to like do like, I don't know, little poems or like images or like anything. You just wanted some creative stimulation. There is a lot of that in this book, but there's loads of those definitions. So it is a very surreal, very cerebral, philosophical book with this like weird narrative that's also going on throughout it. And I didn't understand the point of it probably until I was about 93% of the way through the book. And then I was like, oh my God, I think I know what this is. And then 3 paragraphs later, he tells you what it is. So I don't think I can say that I guessed where it was going, because I was really down to the wire on that one. But it's very clever. There's beautiful writing in it. But it is not for the people who need the plot. There is plot. It's just very heavily masked. And for me, I thought there was the weighting felt off for me. I would have preferred more of the narrative and less of the Book of All Loves in it, because it did feel like sometimes I'm like, okay, I get it, loads of definitions of love, like, can we get back to the story, please? And I'm not a plotty person, so if I'm feeling like that. But yeah, I think it was interesting and quirky enough that I would definitely read other things that he's done. He is without doubt a beautifully lyrical writer. He's just does not feel the need at all to make life easy for the reader, even a little bit. And there's a few more authors in this pile who are also like that. I need a gulp of coffee before I talk about this next one. Right, let's get it over with. This is The Engineer of Human Souls by Joseph Szkeberecki. This is one of the books that I actually owned and had been sat on my shelf for a really long time, because I used to do this thing. Because my mother mistakenly, when I was a teenager, gave me a book, The 1001 Books to Read Before You Die. And I am quite a literal person sometimes. And so I thought, oh, I have to read all of these books before I die. And this was on that list. So I saw it in a charity shop about 6 years ago, picked it up. It's sat on my shelf ever since, because look at the size of it, and it's about war, and I was like, oh God. And this wasn't what I thought it was going to be, but it also wasn't better than I thought it was going to be. So this is a Czech book, but again, was it written in English? I'm pretty sure it was. Oh no, sorry, apologies. Translated by Paul Wilson from the Czech. So, if you've seen my quarter-year crisis video, you will have already seen me talk about why this book disappointed me, or the fact that it was a book that disappointed me. And I think it's more that this was never going to be this wasn't a book for me, and I should have DNF'd it and I didn't, and that is on me. That's not on the book. But this is about a man who was born in what was Czechoslovakia and is now living as an exile in Canada and working as a literature professor. Each of the sections, each of the chapters, there's only about 7, I think, are named after a different writer, and all of those writers are in the Western tradition, which I thought was interesting, but I guess they were linking to what was on the curriculum that he was teaching at the university. And it's sort of, they each began with him in his classroom, pretty much, talking to his students about that writer, and then very quickly we splinter off in all directions, taking in his childhood in Czechoslovakia, which was both under Nazi control and then later under USSR control. And it just, I'm sure if you're very familiar with the geopolitics of that region and that time, then there was probably loads of stuff going on, but I just felt so rudderless in this book, and I just didn't know why I was being told what I was being told. It felt like we weren't building towards something. I felt like on a micro level, there were bits that I was interested in. There were interesting themes around censorship and writing, and a writer's role in enacting social change, or at least holding that mirror up to the world and letting us see our political structures for what they are. And I think that was all really good, but I just didn't enjoy the reading experience of it. It didn't really help you by giving you a sense of how far back in time you jumped, and I think the timelines all overlapped, and I just got she well and truly lost the plot with it, and I just really didn't enjoy the reading experience. And for the latter chunk, I was skim reading, if I'm honest. So this one, not for me. The next book I read, another historical fiction novel, although a different one this time. This is The Traitor's Niche by Ismail Kadare, which is translated from the Albanian by John Hodgson. And this is a historical novel set during the height of the Ottoman Empire. And we follow a couple of different characters who have something to do with the Traitor's Niche. So The Traitor's Niche is a plinth that's been carved into a corner of of a square in the central city. I can't remember which city, but one of the central cities in the Ottoman Empire. And it is where the decapitated heads of dissidents and traitors are displayed to the people. And so, yeah, we're also dealing with political censorship in this book. But we follow, for example, the man whose job it is to sort of preserve the heads, because obviously the leaders of the empire want these heads to stay there for as long as possible, so he has to kind of take care of them and try and preserve them as much as possible so they don't like completely rot and become slime. So there's one guy where that's his job, and then there's another guy whose job it is to like ride out after someone's been killed. Obviously the Ottoman Empire was huge, so he's the guy who has to ride out and like collect the head and transport it back to the Traitor's Niche. And then the main narrative of the book is concerned with whether or not this rebel from Albania, which is right out on like the edge, it's on the outskirts of the empire, whether or not this traitor is going to be killed, is going to be killed by the emperor, and that's what we're kind of concerned with. And I really liked the way we moved geographically in this book. So we move from kind of the centre out to the outskirts to Albania, which obviously this is an Albanian author. So we move out to Albania, to the outskirts, and then we move back into the centre, which was really, I think it was really well done. It really gave a sense of scale to the empire, and I think worked really well in a relatively short book. I really kind of got a feel for how big that was, because I've not really read. It's not like a period of history that I know very much about, or that I've read very much about. And obviously this is a book that is dealing very explicitly with empire, and it has been written from the perspective, partially, or at least the author's perspective on it as an Albanian, is kind of very critical of empire, quite rightly. But he's not just talking about the Ottoman Empire, and it's very clear that he's not just talking about the empire that's presented in the book, and that there's kind of like other undercurrents, more I think than I was able to pick up on, because I, again, not super au fait on Albanian history, but I'm getting there. I'm learning so much about Europe, guys. Yeah, overall, I liked this book. I wasn't blown away by it. I wasn't blown away by the writing, but I enjoyed it, certainly more than I've enjoyed a number of the other books that I have read for this challenge. So that was nice. It was nice to read a book that I just didn't find like straight up problematic. So yeah, I liked it. And Ismail Kadare has he won the very first International Booker Prize, I think. It was called something else at the time, but like the first International Booker. And I think he was nominated, longlisted this year as well. So, I mean, he's obviously like a very well-respected, very good writer. So this was the first of his that I've read, but I'll definitely look for more by him. Next up, we have Homo Faber by Max Frisch, which was translated from the German by Michael Bullock. And although it was written in German, this is a Swiss book. And this is, unfortunately, like just another, it's one of the ones that I've read where it was fine. It was all right. Parts of it I liked. But it's not one that I think is going to leave much of a lasting impression, sadly. So this is a book where we are following Walter. Walter is an engineer of some description, and he is a man whose world is ruled by rationality and logic and empiricism. And it's kind of a road book. Well, not just road. It's a travel book. There's a lot of journeying happening in this book, and so it begins with him like taking a flight, and he just encounters lots of things. Things keep happening to him that are very, very unlikely. A series of strange coincidences and occurrences, and slowly this sort of dismantles his belief or reliance on this sort of empirical way of living. He is a man who has emotionally closed himself off a lot, and as life and the world sort of chip away at him and these weird things keep happening to him, he sort of opens himself up a little bit more to the emotional experience of being a human, as well as the intellectual experience of being a human. And yeah, there were some instances that I found like quite emotionally affecting, and bits of it. Generally, I think there was a kind of wry sense of humour that I quite liked. Walter's an interesting character. So this book was written in the 50s, like the late 50s, I think. And so this language is never used, but Walter to me felt very autistic coded as a character. And so that, I don't know, that was interesting. I think that's the oldest book that I've read that I felt that strongly about. So I'm like, yeah, I'm not saying it is the earliest. I'm not saying that the author's intention was to write a character like that, but I think it was really interesting to kind of look at him through that lens. That's at least what his character felt like to me. And he is sort of, I mentioned that there was a lot of journeys that go on. This is sort of book about him sort of trying to find home and purpose. And I think that relates more to, that, again, that post-war sort of identities from all of the kind of countries in Europe, pretty much dealing with the sort of shifts in borders, shifts in identities and perspectives that came about after the war, and a huge number of people feeling sort of culturally and literally displaced. So I think there were interesting themes. It just like it wasn't going to become like a favorite book. I mostly enjoyed the reading experience, but also if I hadn't read it, that would have been fine too. Do you know what I mean? And sadly, that theme is going to continue, unfortunately. So we're going to Georgia next. This is The Pear Field by Nana. I'm going to look up. I feel like I've done all right with the pronunciations, but Nana Ekvitimishvili. Butchered it. Absolutely butchered it. There's so many consonants, I've got no idea. Yes, but it was translated from the Georgian by Elizabeth Highway. And yeah, this follows a teenage girl called Leela who is living in Georgia in a kind of like backwater town. And she grew up in a residential home for children with disabilities. And she's aged out of the school now, like she's 18 or 19, but she's still living there because she doesn't really have anywhere else to go. Having read the description of the book, because that school is referred to in the book by characters in the book, not the author, characters, as the school for idiots. And I knew that from reading the blurb, and so I went in with a certain amount of trepidation about how disability was going to be handled in this book. And I didn't love it. Now, I particularly know, if you saw my Paris blog, you will know that the reason I was in Paris was because I was at this global forum of inclusive education. And I am very aware that different countries in different parts of the world are on different journeys, at different points in their journey of inclusivity and inclusive language. And so I understand that I cannot put my British sensibilities on a book that has been written in another part of the world, right? But I really didn't enjoy the way these characters were portrayed or treated. And it's not because they were necessarily caricatured. I think it's that their lived experience just wasn't really explored at all. I think the book was really, because it was uncovering a lot of corruption and exploring how the state in Georgia was not supporting and has not supported the most vulnerable of its citizens. And I think it's laudable to talk about that, but I just wish it hadn't felt quite so distanced. And I was uncomfortable for a lot of the book with how characters were being spoken about or not spoken about, actually. I also just found the plot like a little bit thin. A threat is made very early on that we suspect will be acted on, and that will be the kind of arc of the book. And it sort of is, but it's like the threat's made at the beginning and returned to at the end. And most of the shit in the middle just felt very not connected to it. So yeah, that one wasn't a favourite. And and we're continuing. I promise things will get happier. We'll have some more positive book reviews in a minute, but not just yet. Next up was my German pick. This was Dance by the Canal by Kerstin Hensel, which was translated from the German by Jen Kayeha. And this is a novel set in East Berlin, so like pre the Berlin Wall coming down. And it's a first-person narrative of a young woman. She's telling her life story, or at least her life story to that date, because she's still quite young. And she grew up in East Berlin. Her father was a surgeon, so they grew up kind of like middle class, upper middle class, really, very wealthy sort of bourgeoisie, but obviously East Berlin under communist control. That meant that they were pretty heavily vilified, and their kind of wealth and status was dismantled over time, kind of systematically through the state, but also just personally through things that happened. And we know that things go wrong in her life because at the outset of the book, she is choosing to write her story, and at the time she is rough sleeping under a bridge and sort of makes the decision to write down her life story on a number of any bits of paper that she can kind of get her hands on. So we know that things have gone badly for her. And this is the story of how she's sort of ended up here. But she's a very unreliable narrator, or at least I don't know if she was intentionally unreliable, but I found her a very unreliable narrator. But I think given what she's been through and everything that's going on kind of socially around her, there's lots of duality in the book, as you'd kind of expect, it being set in a city that is literally cleaved in two. And so, like, thematically, there's interesting stuff going on in there. It felt very, like, episodic, and the unreliability is really ramps up towards the close of the book, and then the narrative becomes really quite unwieldy, as sort of her writing of her life is getting closer and closer to her present day experience. It kind of becomes a little bit more frantic and a little bit harder to follow. And I think it is a book that is about how difficult it is to feel like we don't have the words or the language or the means to communicate our experience to people. And I'm on board with books that are about that. I think fundamentally that's literature, isn't it? It's all art in lots of ways. And I liked I liked the writing. I liked that central theme, but it didn't. It's not a book that's gonna stay with me either. Sadly, bummer. This is the last one. Well, no, this is the last one for the Euros. Oh my God, an hour in. Oh my God, no wonder my throat hurts. I was like, oh, I'm getting a tickly cough. I've been talking for an hour. This book. This is Until Stones Become Lighter Than Water by Antonio Lobo Antunes, which is translated from the Portuguese by Jeff Love. This is possibly the book I'm saddest about, because I picked this up when I was in Portugal. I went to Livraria Bertrand, which is the oldest bookshop in operating bookshop in the world, the oldest bookshop that is still operating in the world. And I picked this up because it sounded brilliant. It is about a young boy from Angola who is adopted by a Portuguese soldier during the Angolan colonial war. And you know from both the blurb and very early on in the book that this boy, as an adult, plans to kill that man, plans to kill his father. And I was like, oh, that sounds great. That sounds really, really good. And as a premise, I was so intrigued. And I also, I know that it is not a lot of white Portuguese writers are writing about the Portuguese colonial history. It doesn't make it into a lot of books, and it really doesn't make it into a lot of books that get translated into English. So I respected the book for that. But this is written in a way that I just really, really struggled with intellectually. Like, I am willing to admit that I think I was just not smart enough for this book. I don't think I was clever enough, because this is written in such a challenging way. There is, even more so than the birthday party, this is like the birthday party on steroids. We are moving between time and characters' heads with absolutely no grammatical indication or narrative indication of when you have moved and where you have moved to and whose head you have moved into. Sometimes you can pick it up quite quickly. Sometimes I was reading it like, I don't know when we are. I don't know who we are. It's got about 13 chapters, and every single chapter is one continual sentence. And I couldn't do it. I couldn't do it. Some of the writing was really beautiful, but I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was going on. There was a lot of repetition. So there was this central image that they came back to throughout of, I guess it's like a Portuguese traditional custom of like killing a pig, maybe to do with some kind of like feast day or particular day of celebration, but where the family all come round and they string up a pig by its legs and kill it. Sounds, you know, no, I was going to say sounds delightful. I'm a vegan. It doesn't sound great to me, but I'm not knocking your culture. That's your culture, fine. But that kept being repeated, and I didn't know where we were in time. It also repeats the title numerous points, and I just felt the whole thing to be really, really laboured. I think for me, it could have worked as like more of a novella length. I think I could have just about sustained my thinking powers for like 100 pages. But this was like 350 pages, and it was too much for me. It was just too much for me. I didn't understand. That's probably on me, but I didn't understand. I couldn't access the story in this book. I don't know what happened. I don't know what happened. So thematically, I really wanted to love it. And I'm obviously, I've spoken about a number of books already that do interesting and weird things that I really liked. So I'm not open to it, but this just, unfortunately, and I'm really sad about it. I'm really so sad about it. But that is it for Euros reading. Okay. So mostly things are going to look up from here. Mostly. Very good. So I read an audiobook of Before I Go to Sleep by S.J. Watson, which was read by Susanna Harker. This was one of those audiobooks that I was just like scrolling through BorrowBox because I unexpectedly finished an audiobook. I think I DNF'd an audiobook. And I was just like looking for something that I could listen to now. So I was like looking for like what was currently available, and this was there, and I thought, oh, all right. And this is about a woman who wakes up and remembers herself being a very young woman, like in her early 20s. And as she's sort of moving around her room, she has no memory of who she is, really. But she's looking at these photos and realizing, oh my God, I think that's me, but I'm old. Well, like in her like 50s, I think, late 40s, early 50s. And she goes downstairs and she meets a man who says that he's her husband. And there's photos of them together, so he probably is her husband. And it sort of becomes clear that she's got amnesia, but a really weird and rare and narratively convenient kind of amnesia, where she had a traumatic brain injury, and she can't remember her life after she had that injury, but she remembers everything while she's awake, as in like she can talk to people, she can work things out for the duration that she's awake, and then she goes to sleep and she forgets everything that she found out the day before. So every day she wakes up with no idea who she is. And over the course of the book, this is a crime thriller in case that wasn't clear, we begin to ask questions about whether the stories she's being told about her life are true or not. I can't remember what happens in the end. I vaguely remember this book being fine, if a little contrived in terms of like the setup. But it was fine. It passed the time. I remember sort of like enjoying listening to it, but it's not one that's going to stay with me. However, the next 4 books that I have to talk to you about are all part of the same series, and I really liked them all. Thank goodness. Over the last 2 months, I finished the Frieda Klein series by Nicci French. So I was put onto these books by watching Jen Campbell's channel, because she raves about Nicci French in general, but this particular series, the Frieda Klein series, and I have to agree, I think they are excellent. So it's a series of 7 books, and they all have like a day of the week in them. So it starts with Blue Monday, and I read Thursday's Child, Friday On My Mind, Saturday Requiem, and Sunday Morning Coming Down. I listened to all of them on audio, and they're all brilliantly narrated by Beth Chambers. And yeah, I think I really enjoyed them. These are really great crime books. They follow Frieda Klein, who is a psychotherapist who sort of accidentally becomes embroiled in police investigations, in criminal investigations. And I'll briefly talk about the four books kind of separately. Thursday's Child I really liked because it started to step more away from procedural and was very much more about Frieda and her life and her history. So it really felt like we got to know her a little bit more in that book, and I really enjoyed that. I think it was my favourite of the series, I think. Friday on My Mind, they take it in a direction. Nicci French take it in a direction, and I think if I were to reread this book, I would enjoy it more, but I was reeling so much from the direction that they took it in that it took me a little while to catch up and get on board with the direction that they were going in. But on the whole, having now finished the series, I get it, but like when I was reading it, I was a bit like, no, why are you doing this? Go back. I feel like that with series sometimes. You know, when you watch procedurals and then inevitably after a couple of series, they start to go, oh, we can't just be a procedural anymore. We got to introduce these kind of like wider arcs. And I get that that's how writing a series works, and I do understand it. But like part of my lizard brain is like, just do the same thing over again with a different story. Go on. But yeah, I'm over it now. So Friday, I didn't love so much. Saturday, I actually can't remember what actually happens in that book much, except I do remember that it had the most ridiculous cliffhanger that I had to just immediately start listening to the final book, Sunday Coming Down. And I think this was a masterful ending to the series, because what Nicci French managed to do with this series is end it in a way that makes complete sense for the characters as we have grown to understand them, and yet isn't very satisfying. Like, it's not a happy ending, but it's not one of those stupid endings where you're like, why did you do that? Like, where it feels like they've done it just to not give you a happy ending. So I love these books. I own them all now. So I will definitely be revisiting them. They were fab. I really recommend them. So that was those four. And then on to another series of books. I read book 3 and 4 of ACOTAR by Sarah J. Maas. Look, I was having, as you can probably tell, generally a pretty miserable reading time. And I thought, I need a little brain holiday from how difficult some of these books were to read. And I read A Court of Wings and Fury and A Court of Frost and Starlight. A Court of Wings and Fury was fine. I enjoyed the reading of it. I think I do quite like having these books to go to that are so far out of my normal genres of reading, because it always just feels like a little holiday to be like, I'm just going to read this now. And yeah, I enjoyed that. A Court of Frost and Starlight I thought was ultimately pointless. It's like a novella that she just like put in between book 3 and what really should be book 4 but is actually book 5, and it just didn't move anything forward from my understanding. Perhaps I think maybe it's just like an entire book of Easter eggs that if you've read the entire series or the entire series so far, because it's not finished, is it? Yeah, but if you've read it, if you're one of those people like me who mostly read literary fiction but occasionally have a holiday in ACOTAR, please tell me what the point of A Court of Frost and Starlight was, because I do not know. And then I saw on Everand, I didn't even know that this was a thing, that Ali Smith had a really short audiobook on there, which is the story of Antigone, that she's rewritten. And Ali Smith narrates this herself. It's part of like a wider series, I think, of myth retellings for children, and Ali Smith did Antigone. So if you're familiar with the Greek myth of Antigone, you'll know what it's about. I think it's most famous from Sophocles' play, but it is about a young woman who defies her uncle, who is in power, by her brother is considered a traitor, and he's killed, and she defies orders and buries his body. And I really enjoyed this. It's a really short audiobook. I think it's like an hour long. And it was lovely. It was really nice that Ali Smith read it herself. Obviously, because it's for children, she doesn't dwell on some of the much darker elements of Antigone's story, but she also doesn't shy away from some of the like challenging concepts and the kind of key themes in the book. And I really, really, really loved the way she used animals as the chorus in it. And yeah, it was just like a lovely, if you've like got like a task to do in your house, you know, like you've got like a pile of ironing, if you're the sort of put together human who does ironing, if you've got a stack of ironing to do, or like, you know, like a craft that you want to finish, I recommend just putting this on in the background. It was lovely. And I will, I think, have a little look for other ones in that series. I think that's the only one she's done. But yeah, so there was that. And then another really good audiobook. Thank goodness we're getting some positive stuff, guys. Oh my God. I read Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, which is narrated by James Good, and really loved this book. It's my first Bernardine Evaristo, if you can believe it. I know, what have I been doing with my life? But it will not be my last. So that's nice. This is the story of a man called Barrington, who is originally from Antigua and now living in the UK. He is in his 70s. He is married to a woman called Carmel, and he has been in love with his best friend Morris and having a relationship with his best friend Morris since they were boys. So their entire lives. And so he's been leading this double life. He's got a wife and children, and he also has this best friend who everyone, you know, kind of knows as like Uncle Morris, but who he's actually been having a romantic relationship with for decades and decades and decades. And the book is really concerned with whether or not at this late point in his life he is willing, able, or even wants to finally come out to his family and live authentically with this man that he has been in love with for so long. And I loved this book so much for the characters and how complex and difficult they were. Barrington is, on the one hand, I was deeply, deeply empathized with like how uncomfortable he felt in his own queerness, but also he's just this charming, funny, intelligent man. But he's also dealing with a lot of internalized homophobia, and he can be very misogynistic. He's very mean about his wife in multiple occasions. And so you feel really conflicted about him. He's like, you love him, but he's also very flawed. And so are all of the other characters. The messiness of the family dynamics I loved. And it really reminded me of On Beauty by Zadie Smith, which is another book that I really like, that just has these like incredibly realistic and believable portrayals between family members where no one is right. No one's in the right. No one's in the wrong. Everyone's just like in this grey space of, I'm a probably fundamentally good person who is flawed, and I'm trying to just, you know, get on with my life. And I loved this, and I have Girl, Woman, Other on my shelf ready to go. I will definitely get to it soon. I absolutely loved this one. And then before we get on to the final three books, which are all non-fiction, I read Whatever You've Got by Molly Naylor, which is a poetry collection. This was bought for me by my best friend, Farmer. So she bought it because she saw Molly Naylor perform as the support act to Grace Petrie. Oh my God, I've totally forgotten how you pronounce her name. Anyway, she bought it for me because she thought I would like her poetry, but also because I'd said that I wanted more bi plus poetry, and Molly Naylor is a bi plus woman, so that was lovely. And if you want to see a taste of what her poetry is like, in the All the Light You Cannot See vlog, Farmer actually does a dramatic reading of a poem in here. And I really, really loved her poetry style. It's got that sort of quite conversational, light touch poetry that on the one hand makes it feel very accessible, but she's also like, she's exploring like real sort of heavy emotional themes, but it does sort of feel like you're talking to your friend when you're reading it. And I really loved it, and I will be checking out more of her writing, because I think she's quite a multidisciplinary writer. I think she also writes for like stage and maybe screen as well. But yeah, loved it. So then, we're getting there. Oh my god, it's gone quicker than I thought it would, to be fair. Non-fiction now. Okay. I read How to Say Babylon by Safiya Sinclair, which I listened to the audiobook of, which is narrated by the author. And this is the only book that I've picked up so far from the first ever Women's Prize for Non-Fiction. I'll be honest, it was one of the ones that most appealed to me, but it was also, crucially, one of the ones that I could get access to without having to buy it specially. So I listened to this on Everand, and I really enjoyed this. This was, I think it's been shortlisted now, and I'm really glad that it has. It's a memoir about Safiya growing up in Jamaica under very strict Rastafarian rule. Her dad was a Rastafarian, and I really didn't know that much about that religion. I knew like a few, like cultural touch points. I know about Bob Marley and things like that, but like I didn't know how rigid some of the rules were, and I didn't know how patriarchal the like gender attitudes were, at least in her father's interpretation. Like I think he was like a pretty like hard line, but also like the history of Rastafarian, like where it came from, and she goes into like a bit of that, but it is mostly a personal memoir of her sort of growing up in this very oppressive atmosphere and trying to find her voice. She is a poet, and you could tell that she was a poet. It was really beautifully written. I think there were moments where it lost its way a little bit in terms of just the flow of it, but I think that often happens with memoir, and I'm never going to criticize someone for how they choose to tell the story of their own lives. So also because she read it herself, like there are some really scary moments in this book, and it was really powerful to hear her read it, because I felt like you could really hear her reliving some of the things that she went through. And yeah, I really recommend it if you're looking for a memoir. And strong recommend. Really liked it. And then another memoir of sorts, and this is another one actually that I mentioned, I think, in that Paris vlog. I read Kitchen Confidential: Adventures in the Culinary Underbelly by Anthony Bourdain. Now, this also read by Anthony Bourdain. I am a big fan of Anthony Bourdain. I really loved Parts Unknown, which is, if you haven't seen it, a kind of like travel and food documentary series that Anthony Bourdain did. He's a chef. He was a chef, but also someone that was just very interested in the interplay between like place and food. And so I loved that travel show so much, because it really felt like he was exploring the food, but really exploring the place and really getting under the skin of the people from those places. So I recommend that if you're interested in like that sort of TV. I thought it was excellent. And this is what the subtitle makes it sound like. This isn't like a linear narrative memoir. These are a series of recollections, episodes from his life, almost like little mini essays, like memoir-y essays. But he's so funny and so clever and wry, and really just like, he's such a New Yorker. And I love this. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was great. I have nothing else to add. And then, oh my God, guys, the final one. And don't worry, I'm not even actually going to review this book, because I read this for like personal reasons, but I'm going to mention briefly. This is The Body That Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And this is Mind, Brain and Body in the Transformation of Trauma. The author, Bessel van der Kolk, is one of the leading global experts on trauma. And if you are at all interested in understanding the impact that having experienced trauma has on your body as well as on your mind, and crucially, some understanding of how to get through that or over that. This book was just really personally helpful for me, and that's all I'm going to say about that. Oh my good Lord. I thought this video was actually going to be so much longer than it was, so I'm sorry if I've been talking a mile a minute. I'm really sorry, but that was so many books and I was a bit scared. I'm sorry that... Also, oh God, I should stop apologising, shouldn't I? It's a shame that I didn't have more positive things to say about more of these books. I am learning my lessons on... It's so funny to me that I decided to do this stupid reading challenge because I'd been having such a lovely time with my impatient reading and doing like all of the things where I just read for whatever the fuck I want, which I've just discovered is truly how I should be reading. It is how I read best, how I have the best experience. But I just ignored all of the things I've learnt about myself as a reader and gave myself a massive TBR, and then was all surprised when I was a bit grumpy about having to read books. Hey ho. I would love to know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. I would love to know what you've been reading recently, any standouts, anything you've loved, anything I should have read instead of the books that I read for countries that I didn't really enjoy the books of. Not that I will be doing this again, but just, you know, for my future impatient reading of world literature. Thanks very much. If you could give this video a little thumbs up, if you're still here, that would be lovely. And subscribe to my channel if you haven't. And I'm not going to do this again. In future, I'm going to make sure I wrap books up every month because this is so many books for me. It's so many books for me to try and remember. Yeah. Goodbye, my friends. I'll see you soon.